Chapter 21. For every jewel a drop of blood. All night Ibn Yad and his party marched northward. Though they were hampered by the refusal of Guinalda to walk, yet they made rapid progress, for they were spurred on by their great desire to escape from the valley with their booty before they should be discovered and set upon by the great host of fighting men they were now convinced were quartered in the castle and city they had been fortunate enough to find almost deserted. Avarice gave them strength and endurance far beyond that which they normally displayed, with the result that dawn found them at the foot of the ragged mountains that Ibn Jad had determined to scale rather than attempt an assault upon the castle which guarded the easy way from the valley. It was a jaded party that won eventually to the pass just above the outer barbican that guarded the road to the city of the sepulchre, nor were they discovered by the warders there until the last man of them was safely on the trail leading to the low saddle at the summit of the mountains, beyond which lay the menzil of the Bedouins. The defenders of the Barbican made a sortie against them and approached their rear so closely that the Sir Knight who commanded saw Guinalda and recognized her. But a volley from the matchlocks of the desert people sent the crudely armed soldiers of Bohun back in retreat, though the brave knight couched his lance and charged again until his horse was brought down by a bullet, and he lay pinned beneath it. It was afternoon before Ibn Jad with his fagged company staggered into the menzil. Though they dropped in their tracks from sheer exhaustion, he allowed them but an hour of sleep before he gave the signal for the rahla, for the sheik of the Fendi El Guad was filled with an ever-increasing fear that the treasure and the woman would be taken away from him before he could reach the sandy wastes of his own barren beld. The heavy weight of the treasure had been divided into several bundles, and these were distributed among his least mistrusted followers, while the custody of the girl captive was placed in the hands of Fard, whose evil eyes filled the princess with fear and loathing. Thimble, who had secretly scoffed at the stories of treasure and the mad tales of a beautiful woman that the Arab expected to find in some fabulous, hidden city, was dumbfounded when he viewed the spoils of the Bedouin raid, and at first was inclined to attribute them to the hallucinations of his fever-racked brain. Weak, Stimble staggered feebly along the trail, keeping as close to Fard as he could, for he knew that of all the company this unscrupulous scoundrel would be most likely to assist him, for to Fard a live Stimble meant great wealth, nor was Fard unmindful of the fact. And now there was another purpose in the evil mind of the Bedouin, who had conceived for the white girl an infatuation that was driving him to the verge of madness. With the wealth that Stimbul had promised him, Fard realized that he could afford to possess this lovely houri, whom otherwise a poor Bedoui must sell for the great price that she would bring, and so there revolved in the mind of Fard many schemes whereby he might hope to gain sole possession of both Guinalda and Stimbul. But always there loomed in the path of every plan that he considered the dour figure of his greedy sheikh. At the foot of the mountains of the sepulchre, Ibn Jad turned toward the east, thus to avoid passing again through the country of Batando. Beyond the eastern end of the range, he would turn south again, and later strike west, just above the northern limits of the territory that was nominally Tarzan's, for though he knew that the Lord of the Jungle was dead, he yet feared the vengeance of his people. It was late before Ibn Jad made camp. The preparations for the evening meal were hurried. The light from the cooking fire and the paper lanterns in the bait of the sheik was dim and flickering, yet not so dim but that Ateja saw Fahd drop something into the bowl of food that she had prepared for Ibn Yad, and which stood upon the ground between him and his would-be assassin. As the sheik reached for the receptacle, Ateja stepped from the women's quarters and struck it from his hand, But before she could explain her act or charge Fard with his villainy, the culprit, realizing that his perfidy had been discovered, leaped to his feet and, seizing his matchlock, sprang into the women's quarters, where Guinalda had been left under the watchful care of Hirfa and Ataja. Seizing the girl by the wrist and dragging her after him, Fard broke through the curtains at the rear of the bait and ran in the direction of his own tent. By this time, the Muqad of Ibn Jad was in an uproar. The sheikh was demanding an explanation from Ataja, and still unaware that Fard had escaped through the rear of the bait, no one had followed him into the women's quarters. "He placed Sim in thy food," cried Ataja. "I saw him, and the proof of it be that he fled when he knew that I had seen." "Billah," exclaimed Ibn Jad, "the son of a jackal would poison me. Seize him and fetch him to me." "He hath fled through the bait," cried Hirfa, "and taken the Nasrawiya with him." The Bedouins sprang to their feet and took after Fard, but at his own bait he stopped them with a bullet, and they retreated. In his tent he seized Stimbul, who was lying upon a filthy sleeping mat, and dragged him to his feet. "Hasten," he hissed in the American's ear. "Ibn Yad has ordered that thou be slain. Quick, follow me, and I will save thee." Again Fard had recourse to the rear curtains of a bayti, and as his fellows approached the front in anger but with caution, Fard, dragging Guinalda and followed by Stimbul, sneaked through the darkness of the menzil and turned toward the west. It was dusk when James Blake, following the plain trail of Ibn Jad, finally clambered over the last escarpment and stood upon the trail that led through the pass toward the outer world beyond the Valley of the Sepulchre. 100 yards to his right loomed the gray towers of the Barbican. To his left was the trail that led in the direction of his heart's desire, and all about him, concealed in the bushes, were the men-at-arms of King Bohun of the Sepulchre. But this he did not guess, for how could he know that for hours the eyes of the warders had been watching his slow ascent toward the pass trail? Spent by the long climb following hours of grueling exertion without food or rest, unarmed, Blake was helpless to resist or to attempt escape when a dozen armed men stepped from the surrounding bushes and encircled him in a band of steel. And so Sir James of Nimmo was seized and hauled before King Bohun, and when he was questioned and Bohun found that he was the same Black Knight that had thwarted his plan to abduct the Princess Guinalda, he could scarce contain himself. Assuring Blake only of the fact that he would be put to death as soon as Bohun could determine upon a fate commensurate with the heinousness of the crime, the king ordered him to be placed in chains, and the American was led away by guards to a black hole beneath the castle, where, by the light of flares, a smith forged a heavy iron band about one ankle, and he was chained to a damp stone wall. In the light of the flare, Blake saw 2 emaciated, naked creatures similarly chained, and in a far corner glimpsed a skeleton, among the bones of which rusted a length of chain and a great anklet. Then silently the guards and the smith departed, taking the flares with them, and James Blake was left in darkness and despair. Upon the plain below the city of Nimr, Tarzan had overtaken the party of Bedouins, led by Abd el-Aziz, and after assuring himself that the girl was not with them, he had turned without revealing himself to them, and hurried northward to take up the trail of the other party. Requiring food and rest, he lay up in the Wood of the Leopards during the heat of the day after stalking Horta the boar and making a quick kill. His belly filled, the ape-man found a high-flung tree crotch where there was little likelihood of the heavy leopards of Nimor disturbing his slumbers, and here he slept until the sun was sinking behind the western mountains. Early the following morning he reached the deserted menzil where Ibn Jad's people had camped during his incursion of the Valley of the Sepulchre. Some time since he had lost the spoor of Blake, but that of the girl frequently recurred, and as her rescue now took precedence over other considerations, he followed doggedly along the trail of Ibn Jad. For a time he was mystified by the fact that Guinalda's spoor, well marked by the imprints of the tiny sandals of medieval design, did not appear among the footprints of those who left the Bedouin Menzil. He lost some time searching about in an effort to discover a clue to the riddle, and presently he hit upon the truth, which lay in the fact that Guinalda's light sandals having been badly worn by her journey, and far too tight for comfortable walking, she had been given a pair belonging to Atea, and thus it became difficult to differentiate between the spoor of the two girls, who were of equal weight and of a similarity of carriage that rendered their footprints practically identical. Tarzan therefore contented himself with following the spoor of the party, and so it was that he passed their first night's camp, where Fard had stolen Guinalda from the sheik, without discovering that 3 of its members had there turned to the west, while the main body of the Arab marched toward the east. And as Tarzan followed the spoor of Ibn Jad, 100 stalwart Waziri moved northward from the waterhole of the smooth, round rocks upon the old trail of the Bedouins. With them was Zayd, who had begged so hard to accompany them when they passed the village where he had been waiting, that at last the sub-chief had consented. When the Tarzan overtook the Arab, they had already turned south around the eastern end of the mountains of the Sepulchre. He saw the bags they carried and the evident concern with which Ibn Jad watched and guarded them, and he shrewdly guessed that the wily old thief had indeed found the treasure he had sought. But he saw no evidence of the presence of the princess, and Stimbul too was missing. Tarzan was furious. He was furious at the thieving Bedouins for daring to invade his country, and he was furious at himself because he felt that in some way he had been tricked. Tarzan had his own methods of inflicting punishment upon his enemies, and he had, as well, his own grim and grisly sense of humor. When men were doing wrong, it pleased him to take advantage of whatever might cause them the greatest suffering, and in this he was utterly ruthless with his enemies. He was confident that the Arab thought him dead, and it did not suit his whim to reveal their error to them at this time, but it did accord with his fancy to let them commence to feel the weight of his displeasure and taste the first fruits of their villainy. Moving silently through the trees, Tarzan paralleled the course of the Arab. They were often plainly visible to him, but none saw Tarzan nor dreamed that savage eyes were watching their every move. 5 men carried the treasure, though its weight was not so great but that one powerful man might have borne it for a short distance. Tarzan watched these men most often, these and the Sheikh Ibn Yad. The trail was wide, and the sheik walked beside one of those who bore the treasure. It was very quiet in the jungle. Even the Arab, garrulous among themselves, were quiet, for they were very tired, and the day was hot, and they were unused to the burdens they were forced to carry, since Batando had robbed them of their slaves. Of a sudden, without warning, and with only the swish of its flight through the air to announce it, an arrow passed through the neck of the Bedouin who walked beside Ibn Jad. With a scream, the man lunged forward upon his face, and the Arab, warned by their sheik, cocked their muskets and prepared to receive an attack. But look where they would, they saw no sign of an enemy. They waited, listening, but there was no sound other than the droning of insects and the occasional raucous cry of a bird. But when they moved on again, leaving their fellow dead upon the trail, hollow voice called to them from a distance. For every jewel a drop of blood. It wailed dismally, for its author knew well the intensely superstitious nature of the desert dwellers and how best to affright them. It was a shaken column that continued on its way, nor was there any mention of making camp until almost sunset, so anxious were they all to leave behind this gloomy wood and the horrid Afrit that inhabited it. but the forest persisted, and at length it became necessary to make camp. Here the campfires and food relieved the tension upon their overwrought nerves, and their spirits had revived to such an extent that there were again singing and laughter in the menzil of Ibn Jad. The old sheikh himself sat in his muqad, surrounded by the 5 bags of treasure, one of which he had opened, and beneath the light of a lantern was fondling the contents. About him were his cronies, sipping their coffee. Suddenly something fell heavily upon the ground before the bite, and rolled into the muqad among them. It was the severed head of a man. Glaring up at them were the dead eyes of their fellow, whose corpse they had left lying in the trail earlier in the day. Horror-struck, spellbound, they sat staring at the gruesome thing when, from out of the dark forest, came the hollow voice again. For every jewel a drop of blood. Ibn Jad shook as a man with ague. The men of the camp gathered close together in front of the bait of the sheik. Each grasped a musket in one hand and searched for his hijab with the other, for each carried several of these amulets, and that in demand this night was the one written against the Yan, for certainly none but a jinn could have done this thing. Hirfa stood half within the muqad, staring at the dead face of her fellow, while Ateya crouched upon a sleeping mat in the quarters of the women. She did not see the back curtain rise, nor the figure that crept within. It was dark in the quarters of the harem, since little light filtered in from the lanterns in the muqad. Ateya felt a hand clapped across her mouth at the same instant that another grasped her by the shoulder. A voice whispered in her ear, "Make no sound. I shall not hurt thee. I am a friend to Zayd. Tell me the truth and no harm will befall you or him. Where is the woman Ibn Jad brought from the valley?" He who held her placed his ear close to her lips and removed his hand from them. Ateya trembled like a leaf. She had never seen a jinn. She could not see the creature that leaned close to her, but she knew that it was one of those fearsome creatures of the night. "Answer," whispered the voice in her ear. "If thou wouldst save Zayd, speak and speak the truth." "Fard took the woman from our menzil last night," she gasped. "I do not know where they went." As it came in silence, the presence left the side of the terrified girl. When Hirfa sought her a moment later, she found her in a swoon. Chapter 22, Bride of the Ape. Blake squatted upon the stone floor in the utter darkness of his dungeon. After his jailers had left, he had spoken to his fellow prisoners, but only one had replied, and his gibbering tones assured the American that the poor wretch had been reduced to stark insanity by the horrors of imprisonment in this foul hole. The young man, accustomed to freedom, light activity, already felt the hideousness of his position and wondered how long it would be before he, too, gibbered incoherently at the end of a rusting chain, how long before he, too, was but mildewed bones upon a clammy floor. In utter darkness and in utter silence there is no time, for there is no means by which one may compute the passage of time. How long Blake crouched in the stifling air of his dank dungeon, he could not know. He slept once, but whether he had dozed for an instant or slept the clock around, he could not even hazard a guess. And of what moment was it? A second, a day, a year meant nothing here. There were only 2 things that could mean anything to Jim Blake now: freedom or death. He knew that it would not be long before he would welcome the latter. A sound disturbed the silence of the buried vault. Footsteps were approaching. Blake listened as they came nearer. Presently he discerned a flickering light that grew in intensity until a pine torch illuminated the interior of his prison. At first it blinded his eyes so that he could not see who came bearing the light, but whoever it was crossed and stopped before him. Blake looked up, his eyes more accustomed to the unwonted brilliance, and saw 2 knights standing before him. "It be he," said one. "Dost thou not know us, Sir Black Knight?" demanded the other. Blake looked at them closely. A slow smile lighted his face as he saw a great bandage wrapped about the neck of the younger man. "I suppose," he said, "here is where I get mine." "Get thine. What meanest thou?" demanded the older man. "Well, you two certainly haven't come to pin any medals on me, Sir Wildred," said Blake with a wry smile. "Thou speakest in riddles," said Wildred. "We have come to free thee, that the young king may not bring disgrace upon the knights of the sepulchre by carrying out his wicked will with thee. Sir Guy and I heard that he would burn thee at the stake, and we said to one another that while blood flowed in our bodies, we would not let so valorous a knight be thus shamelessly wronged by any tyrant." As he spoke, Wildred stooped and with a great rasp commenced filing upon the iron rivets that held the hinged anklet in place. "You are going to help me to escape," exclaimed Blake. "But suppose you are discovered, will not the king punish you?" "We shall not be discovered," said Wildred, "though I would take that chance for so noble a sir knight as thee. Sir Guy be upon the outer barbican this night, and 'twill be no trick to get thee that far. He can pass thee through, and thou canst make thy way down the mountainside and cross to Nimber. We cannot get thee through the city gates, for these be held by two of Bohun's basest creatures, but perchance upon the morrow Sir Guy or I may find the way to ride out upon the plain with a led horse, and that we shall, if so it hap that it be possible." "Tell us of a thing that hath filled us with questioning," said Sir Guy. "I don't follow you," said Blake. "Thou didst, and mighty prettily too, take the Princess Guinalda from under the very nose of Bohun," continued Guy, "and yet later she was seen in the clutches of the Saracens. How came this to pass?" "She was seen?" demanded Blake. "Where?" "Beyond the outer barbican she was, and the Saracens carried her away through the pass that leadeth no man knoweth where," said Wildred. Blake told them of all that had transpired since he had taken Guinalda from Bohun, and by the time he had finished the rivets had been cut, and he stood again a free man. Wildred smuggled him through secret passages to his own quarters, and there gave him food and new clothing and a suit of armor, for now that they knew he was riding out over the pass into the strange country, they had decided that he could only be permitted to do so properly armored, armed, and mounted. It was midnight when Wildred smuggled Blake through the castle gate and rode with him toward the outer barbican. Here Sir Guy met them, and a few minutes later Blake bid these chivalrous enemies goodbye, and, mounted on a powerful charger, his own colors flying from his lance tip, rode beneath the portcullis and out upon the starlit road that led to the summit of the mountains of the sepulchre. Toyat, the king ape, picked a succulent beetle from the decaying bark of a fallen tree. About him were the great savage people of his tribe. It was afternoon, and the apes loafed in the shade of great trees beside a little natural clearing in the jungle. They were content and at peace with all the world. Coming toward them were three people, but the wind blew from the apes toward the people, and so neither Toyat nor any of his fellows caught the scent spore of the Tarmangani. The jungle trail was soft with damp mold, for it had rained the night before, and the feet of the three gave forth no sound that the apes heard. Then, too, the three were moving cautiously, for they had not eaten for 2 days, and they were hunting for food. There was a gray old man, emaciated by fever, tottering along with the aid of a broken tree branch. There was a wicked-eyed Bedouin carrying a long musket, and the third was a girl whose strange garments of splendid stuffs were torn and soiled. Her face was streaked with dirt and was drawn and thin, yet still it was a face of almost heavenly beauty. She walked with an effort, and though she sometimes stumbled from weariness, never did she lose a certain regalness of carriage, nor lower the haughty elevation of her well-molded chin. The Bedouin was in the lead. It was he who first sighted a young ape playing at the edge of the clearing, farthest from the great bulls of the tribe of Toyat. Here was food. The Bedouin raised his ancient weapon and took aim. He pressed the trigger, and the ensuing roar mingled with the scream of pain and terror that burst from the wounded Balu. Instantly, the great bulls leapt to action. Would they flee the feared and hated thunderstick of the Tarmangani, or would they avenge the hurting of the Balu? Who might know? Today they might do the one, tomorrow, under identical circumstances, the other. Today they chose vengeance. Led by Toyat, growling hideously, the bulls lumbered forward to investigate. It was this sight that met the horrified gaze of the three as they followed up Fard's shot to learn if at last they were to eat or if they must plod on hopelessly, weakened by the hunger gnawing at their vitals. Fard and Stimble turned and bolted back down the trail, the Arab, in his cowardly haste, pushing Gwynalda to one side and hurling her to the ground. The leading bull, seeing the girl, leaped upon her and was about to sink his teeth into her neck when Toyat seized him and dragged him from her, for Toyat had recognized her for what she was. The king ape had once seen another Tarmangani she, and had decided that he would like to have one as a wife. The other ape, a huge bull, seeing that Toyat wanted the prey and angered by the bullying manner of the king, immediately decided to contest Toyat's right to what he had first claimed. Baring his fangs, he advanced menacingly toward Toyat, who had dragged the girl back into the clearing. Toyat snarled back at him. "Go away," said Toyat. "This is Toyat's Sheh." "It is Goyad's," replied the other, advancing. Toyat turned back. "I kill," he screamed. Goyad came on, and suddenly Toyat seized Gwynalda in his hairy arms and fled into the jungle. Behind him, bellowing and screaming, pursued Goyad. The Princess Gwynalda, wide-eyed with horror, fought to free herself from the hideous, hairy creature that was bearing her off. She had never seen, nor even heard of such a thing as a great ape, and she thought them now some hideous, low inhabitant of that outer world that she had always been taught consisted of encircling armies of Saracens, and beyond, and at a great distance, a wonderful country known as England. What else was there she had not even tried to guess, but evidently it was a horrid place peopled by hideous creatures, including dragons. Toyat had run no great distance when he realized that he could not escape while burdened with the she, and as he had no mind to give her up, he turned suddenly and faced the roaring Goyad. Goyad did not stop. He came on frothing at the mouth, bristling, snarling, a picture of bestial savagery, power, and frenzied rage. Toyat, relinquishing his hold upon the girl, advanced to meet the charge of his rebellious subject, while Gwynalda, weakened by unaccustomed exertion and lack of nourishment, appalled by the hideous circumstances of her plight, sank panting to the ground. Toyat and Goyad, immersed in the prospect of battle, were oblivious to all else. Could Gwynalda have taken advantage of this temporary forgetfulness of her, she might have escaped. But she was too stunned, too exhausted to take advantage of her opportunity. Spellbound, fascinated by the horror of it, she watched these terrifying primordial man-beasts preparing to do battle for possession of her. Nor was Gwynalda the sole witness of these savage preliminaries. From the concealment of a low bush behind which he lay, another watched the scene with steady, interested eyes. Absorbed by their own passion, neither Toyat nor Goyad noted the occasional movement of the outer leaves of the bush behind which this other watcher lay, a movement imparted by the body of the watcher with each breath and with each slightest change of position. Perhaps the watcher discovered no sporting interest in the impending duel, for just as the two apes were about to engage, he arose and stepped into the open, a great black-maned lion, whose yellow coat gleamed golden in the sunlight. Toyat saw him first, and with a growl of rage turned and fled, leaving his adversary and their prize to whatever fate Providence might hold in store for them. Goyad, thinking his rival had abandoned the field through fear of him, beat loudly upon his breast and roared forth the victory cry of the bull ape. Then, swaggering as became a victor and a champion, he turned to claim the prize. Between himself and the girl, he saw the lion standing, gazing with serious mien straight into his eyes. Goyad halted. Who would not have? The lion was within springing distance, but he was not crouched. Goyad backed away, snarling, and when the lion made no move to follow, the great ape suddenly turned and lumbered off into the jungle, casting many a backward glance in the direction of the great cat, until intervening foliage shut him from his view. Then the lion turned toward the girl, poor little princess. Hopeless, resigned, she lay upon the ground, staring wide-eyed at this new engine of torture and destruction. The king of beasts surveyed her for a moment and then walked toward her. Guinalda clasped her hands and prayed. Not for life, for hope of that she had long since resigned, but for death, speedy and painless. The tawny beast came close. Guinalda closed her eyes to shut out the fearsome sight. She felt hot breath upon her cheek. Its fetid odor assailed her nostrils. The lion sniffed about her. God, why did he not end it? Tortured nerves could endure no more, and Guinalda swooned. Merciful surcease of her suffering. Chapter 23. Jad-bal-ja. Nerve shaken, the remnants of Ibn Jad's company turned toward the west and hastened by forced marches to escape the hideous forest of the Jinn. Abd el-Aziz and those who had accompanied him from the Wood of the Leopards toward Nimr had not rejoined them, nor ever would they. For upon the plain below, the treasure city of the Bedouins, dreaming, the knights of Gobrid had discovered them, and, despite the thundering havoc of the ancient matchlocks, the Iron Knights of Nimr had couched their spears against the Saracens, and once again the victorious cri de guerre of the Crusaders had rung out after 7 centuries of silence to announce a new engagement in the hoary war for the possession of the Holy Land, the war that is without end. From the north a mailed knight rode down through the forests of Galaland. A blue and silver pennon fluttered from his lance. The housings of his great charger were rich with gold and silver from the treasure vaults of Wildred of the Sepulchre. Wide-eyed Gala warriors viewed this solitary anachronism from afar and fled. Tarzan of the apes, ranging westward, came upon the spoor of Fard and Stimble and Guinalda and followed it toward the south. Northward marched 100 ebon giants, veterans of 100 battles, the famed Waziri, and with them came Zaid, the lover of Ataja. One day they came upon a fresh spoor crossing their line of march diagonally toward the southwest. It was the spoor of Arab sandals, those of 2 men and a woman, and when the Waziri pointed them out to Zaid, the young Bedouin swore that he recognized those of the woman as belonging to Ataja, for who knew better the shape and size of her little foot, or the style of the sandals she fabricated. He begged the Waziri to turn aside for a time and aid him in finding his sweetheart, and while the sub-chief was debating the question in his mind, the sound of something hurrying through the jungle attracted the attention of every ear. While they listened, a man staggered into view. It was Fard. Zaid recognized him instantly and as immediately became doubly positive that the footprints of the woman had been made by Ataja. Zaid approached Fard menacingly. "Where is Ataja?" he demanded. "How should I know? I have not seen her for days," replied Fard, truthfully enough. "Thou liest," cried Zaid, and pointed at the ground. "Here are her own footprints beside thine." A cunning expression came into the eyes of Fard. Here he saw an opportunity to cause suffering to the man he hated. He shrugged his shoulders. "Well, if you know, you know," he said. "Where is she?" demanded Zaid. "She is dead. I would have spared you," answered Fard. "Dead? The suffering in that single word should have melted a heart of stone, but not Fard's. I stole her from her father's bite, continued Fard, wishing to inflict as much torture as possible upon his rival. For days and nights she was mine, then a huge ape stole her from me. By now she must be dead. But Fard had gone too far. He had encompassed his own undoing. With a scream of rage, Zaid leaped upon him with drawn kusa, and before the Waziri could interfere or Fard defend himself, the keen blade had drunk thrice in the heart of the lying Bedouin. With bent head and dull eyes, Zaid marched on northward with the Waziri as a mile behind them, a wasted old man, burning with fever, stumbled in the trail and fell. Twice he tried to regain his feet, only to sink weakly back to earth. A filthy, ragged bundle of old bones he lay, sometimes raving in delirium, sometimes so still that he seemed dead. Down from the north came Tarzan of the Apes upon the spoor of Guinalda and the two who had accompanied her. Knowing well the windings of the trail, he took shortcuts, swinging through the branches of the trees, and so it happened that he missed the Waziri at the point where their trail had encountered that of Fard, where Zaid had slain his rival, and presently his nostrils picked up the scent of the Mangani in the distance. Toward the great apes he made his way swiftly, for he feared that harm might befall the girl, should she by any mischance fall into the hands of the anthropoids. He arrived in the clearing where they lazed, a short time after the return of Toyat and Goyad, who by now had abandoned their quarrel, since the prize had been taken by one stronger than either of them. The preliminaries of meeting over and the apes having recognized and acknowledged Tarzan, he demanded if any had seen the Tarmangani, she who had recently passed through the jungle. Mualat pointed at Toyat and Tarzan turned toward the king. "You have seen the she?" demanded Tarzan, fearful, for he did not like the manner of the king ape. Toyat jerked a thumb toward the south. "Numa," he said, and went on hunting for food. But Tarzan knew what the ape meant, as surely as though he had spoken 100 words of explanation. "Where?" asked Tarzan. Toyat pointed straight to where he had abandoned Guinalda to the lion, and the ape-man, moving straight through the jungle along the line indicated by the king ape, went sadly to investigate, although he already guessed what he would find. At least he could drive Numa from his kill and give decent burial to the unfortunate girl. Slowly, consciousness returned to Guinalda. She did not open her eyes, but lay very quiet, wondering if this was death. She felt no pain. Presently, a sickly sweet and pungent odor assailed her nostrils, and something moved very close to her, so close that she felt it against her body, pressing gently, and where it pressed she felt heat as from another body. Fearfully she opened her eyes, and the horror of her predicament again swept over her, for she saw that the lion had lain down almost against her. His back was toward her, his noble head was lifted, his black mane almost brushed her face. He was looking off intently toward the north. Guinalda lay very quiet. Presently she felt, rather than heard, a low rumbling growl that seemed to have its origin deep in the cavernous chest of the carnivore. Something was coming. Even Guinalda sensed that, but it could not be succor, for what could succor her from this hideous beast? There was a rustling among the branches of the trees 100 feet away, and suddenly the giant figure of a demigod dropped to the ground. The lion rose and faced the man. The two stood thus, eyeing one another for a brief moment. Then the man spoke. "Jad-bal-ja," he exclaimed, and then, "Come to heel." The great golden lion whined and strode across the open space, stopping before the man. Guinalda saw the beast look up into the face of the demigod, and saw the latter stroke the tawny head affectionately, but meanwhile the eyes of the man, or god, or whatever he was, were upon Guinalda, and she saw the sudden relief that came to them as Tarzan realized that the girl was unharmed. Leaving the lion, the ape-man crossed to where the princess lay and knelt beside her. "You are the Princess Guinalda?" he asked. The girl nodded, wondering how he knew her. As yet she was too stunned to command her own voice. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She shook her head. "Do not be afraid," he assured her in a gentle voice. "I am your friend. You are safe now." There was something in the way he said it that filled Guinalda with such a sense of safety as all the mailed knights of her father's realm had scarce imparted. I am not afraid any more," she said simply. "Where are your companions?" he asked. She told him all that had happened. "You are well rid of them," said the ape-man, "and we shall not attempt to find them. The jungle will account for them in its own way and in its own good time." "Who art thou?" asked the girl. "I am Tarzan." "How didst thou know my name?" she queried. "I am a friend of one whom you know as Sir James," he explained. "He and I were searching for you." "Thou art his friend?" she cried. "Oh, sweet sir, then thou art mine as well." The ape-man smiled. "Always," he said. "Why did the lion not kill thee, Sir Tarzan?" she demanded, thinking him a simple knight, for in her land there were only these beside the members of her princely house and the pseudo-king of the city of the sepulchre. For in the original company that had been wrecked upon the coast of Africa at the time of the Third Crusade, there were only knights, except one bastard son of Henry II, who had been the original Prince Gobred. Never having been in contact with an English king since they parted from Richard at Cyprus, no Gobred had assumed the right to issue patents of nobility to his followers, solely the prerogative of the king. "Why did the lion not kill me?" repeated Tarzan. "Because he is Jad-bal-ja, the golden lion which I raised from cubhood. All his life he has known me only as friend and master. He would not harm me, and it was because of his lifelong association with human beings that he did not harm you, though I was fearful when I saw him beside you that he had, for a lion is always a lion." "Thou dwellest nearby?" asked the girl. "Far away," said Tarzan, "but there must be some of my people nearby, else Jad-bal-ja would not be here. I sent for my warriors, and doubtless he has accompanied them." Finding that the girl was hungry, Tarzan bade the golden lion remain and guard her while he went in search of food. "Do not fear him," he told her, "and remember that you could not have a protector more competent than he to discourage the approach of enemies." "And well mayst I believe it," admitted Guinalda. Tarzan returned with food, and then, as the day was not done, he started back toward Nimmer with the rescued girl, carrying her as she was now too weak to walk, and beside them strode the great black-maned lion of gold. During that journey, Tarzan learned much of Nimmer and also discovered that Blake's love for his princess was apparently fully reciprocated by the girl, for she seemed never so content as when talking about her Sir James and asking questions concerning his far country and his past life, of which, unfortunately, Tarzan could tell her nothing. Upon the second day the three came to the great cross, and here Tarzan hailed the warders and bade them come and take their princess. She urged the ape-man to accompany her to the castle and receive the thanks of her father and mother. But he told her that he must leave at once to search for Blake, and at that she ceased her urging. "And thou find'st him," she said. "Tell him that the gates of Nimmer be always open to him, and that the Princess Guinalda awaits his return." Down from the cross went Tarzan and Jad-bal-ja, and before she turned back to enter the tunnel that led to her father's castle, the Princess Guinalda stood watching them until a turn in the trail hid them from her view. "May our Lord Jesus bless thee, sweet Sir Knight," she murmured, and watch o'er thee, and fetch thee back once more with my beloved. Chapter 24, Where Trails Met. Down through the forest rode Blake, searching for some clue to the whereabouts of the Arabs, ranging this way and that, following trails and abandoning them. Late one day he came suddenly into a large clearing where once a native village had stood. The jungle had not yet reclaimed it, and as he entered it, he saw a leopard crouching upon the far side, and before the leopard lay the body of a human being. At first Blake thought the poor creature dead, but presently he saw it attempt to rise and crawl away. The great cat growled and advanced toward it. Blake shouted and spurred forward, but Sheeta paid no attention to him, evidently having no mind to give up its prey. But as Blake came nearer, the cat turned to face him with an angry growl. The American wondered if his horse would dare the close proximity of the beast of prey, but he need not have feared, nor would he had he been more fully acquainted with the customs of the Valley of the Sepulchre, where one of the greatest sports of the knights of the two enemy cities is hunting the giant cats with lance alone when they venture from the sanctuary of the Wood of the Leopards. The charger that Blake bestrode had faced many a savage cat, and larger, too, by far than this one, and so he fell into his charging stride with no show of fear or nervousness, and the two thundered down upon Sheeta, while the creature that was to have been its prey looked on with wide, astounded eyes. Within the length of its spring, Sheeta rose swiftly to meet the horse and man. He leaped, and as he leaped he struck full on the metal tip of the great lance, and the wooden shaft passed through him so far that it was with difficulty that the man forced the carcass from it. When he had done so, he turned and rode to the side of the creature, lying helpless on the ground. "My God!" he cried as his eyes rested on the face below him. "Stimbol! Blake!" The younger man dismounted. "I'm dying, Blake," whispered Stimbol. "Before I go, I want to tell you that I'm sorry. I acted like a cad. I guess I've got what was coming to me." "Never mind that, Stimbol," said Blake. "You're not dead yet. The first thing is to get you where there are food and water." He stooped and lifted the emaciated form and placed the man in his saddle. "I passed a small native village a few miles back. They all ran when they saw me, but we'll try there for food." "What are you doing here?" asked Stimbol. "And in the name of King Arthur, where did you get the outfit?" "I'll tell you about it when we get to the village," said Blake. "It's a long story. I'm looking for a girl that was stolen by the Arabs a few days ago." "God!" ejaculated Stimbol. "You know something about her?" demanded Blake. "I was with the man that stole her," said Stimbol, "or at least who stole her from the other Arabs." "Where is she?" "She's dead, Blake." "Dead?" "A bunch of those big anthropoid apes got her. The poor child must have been killed immediately." Blake was silent for a long time, walking with bowed head as, weighted down by heavy armor, he led the horse along the trail. "Did the Arabs harm her?" he asked presently. "No," said Stimbol. "The sheikh stole her either for ransom or to sell her in the north. But Fad stole her for himself, and he took me along because I had promised him a lot of money if he'd save me, and I kept him from harming the girl by telling him that he'd never get a cent from me if he did. I felt sorry for the poor child, and I made up my mind that I was going to save her if I could." When Blake and Stimbol approached the village, the blacks fled, leaving the white men in full possession of the place. It did not take Blake long to find food for them both. Making Stimbol as comfortable as possible, Blake found fodder for his horse and presently returned to the old man. He was engaged in narrating his experiences when he was suddenly aware of the approach of many people. He could hear voices and the pad of naked feet. Evidently, the villagers were returning. Blake prepared to meet them with friendly overtures, but the first glimpse he had of the approaching party gave him a distinct shock. For these were not the frightened villagers he had seen scurrying into the jungle a short time before. With white plumes waving above their heads, a company of stalwart warriors came swinging down the trail. Great oval shields were upon their backs, long war spears in their hands. "Well," said Blake, "I guess we're in for it. The villagers must have sent for their big brothers." The warriors entered the village, and when they saw Blake, they halted in evident wonder. One of their number approached him and, to Blake's surprise, addressed him in fairly good English. "We are the Waziri of Tarzan," he said. "We search for our chief and master. Have you seen him, Bwana?" "The Waziri?" Blake could have hugged them. He had been at his wit's end to know what he was to do with Stimble. Alone, he never could have brought the man to civilization, but now he knew that his worries were over. Had it not been for the grief of Blake and Zaid, it had been a merry party that made free with the cassava and beer of the villagers that night, for the Waziri were not worrying about their chief. "Tarzan cannot die," said the sub-chief to Blake, when the latter asked if the other felt any fear as to the safety of his master, and the simple conviction of the quiet words almost succeeded in convincing Blake of their truth. Along the trail plodded the weary Arab of the Beni Salem Fendi, El Guad. Tired men staggered beneath the weight of half-loads. The women carried even more. Ibn Jad watched the treasure with greedy eyes. An arrow came from nowhere and pierced the heart of a treasure-bearer close before Ibn Jad. A hollow voice sounded from the jungle. "For every jewel a drop of blood." Terrified, the Bedouins hastened on. Who would be next? They wanted to cast aside the treasure, but Ibn Jad, greedy, would not let them. Behind them they caught a glimpse of a great lion. He terrified them because he did not come nearer or go away. He just stalked silently along behind. There were no stragglers. An hour passed. The lion paced just within sight of the tail end of the column. Never had the head of one of Ibn Jad's columns been so much in demand. Everyone wished to go in the lead. A scream burst from another treasure carrier. An arrow had passed through his lungs. "For every jewel a drop of blood." The men threw down the treasure. "We will not carry the accursed thing more," they cried, and again the voice spoke. "Take up the treasure, Ibn Jad," it said. "Take up the treasure. It is thou who murdered to acquire it. Pick it up, thief and murderer, and carry it thyself." Together the Arab made the treasure into one load and lifted it to Ibn Jad's back. The old sheik staggered beneath the weight. "I cannot carry it," he cried aloud. "I am old, and I am not strong." "Thou canst carry it, or die," boomed the hollow voice, while the lion stood in the trail behind them, his eyes glaring fixedly at them. Ibn Jad staggered on beneath the great load. He could not now travel as fast as the others, and so he was left behind with only the lion as company. But only for a short time. Ateja saw his predicament and came back to his side, bearing a musket in her hands. "Fear not," she said. "I am not the son thou didst crave, but yet I shall protect thee even as a son." It was almost dusk when the leaders of the Bedouin company stumbled upon a village. They were in it and surrounded by 100 warriors before they realized that they were in the midst of the one tribe of all others they most feared and dreaded, the Waziri of Tarzan. The sub-chief disarmed them at once. "Where is Ibn Jad?" demanded Zaid. "He cometh," said one. They looked back along the trail, and presently Zaid saw 2 figures approaching. One was a man bent beneath a great load, and the other was that of a young girl. What he did not see was the figure of a great lion in the shadows behind them. Zaid held his breath because, for an instant, his heart had stopped beating. "Tayya!" he cried, and ran forward to meet her and clasp her in his arms. Ibn Jad staggered into the village. He took one look at the stern visages of the dread Waziri and sank weakly to the ground, the treasure almost burying him as it fell upon his head and shoulders. Herfa voiced a sudden scream as she pointed back along the trail, and as every eye turned in that direction, a great golden lion stepped into the circle of the firelight in the village, and at its side strode Tarzan, Lord of the Jungle. As Tarzan entered the village, Blake came forward and grasped his hand. "We were too late," said the American sadly. "What do you mean?" asked the ape-man. "The Princess Guinalda is dead." "Nonsense!" exclaimed Tarzan. "I left her this morning at the entrance to the city of Nimr." A dozen times Tarzan was forced to assure Blake that he was not playing a cruel joke upon him. A dozen times Tarzan had to repeat Guinalda's message. "And thou findst him, tell him that the gates of Nimr be always open to him, and that the Princess Guinalda awaits his return." Later in the evening, Stimble, through Blake, begged Tarzan to come to the hut in which he lay. "Thank God!" exclaimed the old man fervently. "I thought that I had killed you. It has preyed on my mind, and now I know that it was not you. I believe that I can recover." "You will be taken care of properly, Stimble," said the ape-man. "And as soon as you are well enough, you will be taken to the coast." Then he walked away. He would do his duty by the man who had disobeyed him and tried to kill him, but he would not feign a friendship he did not feel. The following morning they prepared to leave the village. Ibn Yard and his Arabs, with the exception of Zayd and Atiyah, who had asked to come and serve Tarzan in his home, were being sent to the nearest Gala village under escort of a dozen Waziri. Here they would be turned over to the Gala and doubtless sold into slavery in Abyssinia. Stimble was borne in a litter by 4 stout Waziri, as the party prepared to take up its march toward the south and the country of Tarzan. 4 others carried the treasure of the city of the sepulchre. Blake, dressed again in his iron mail, bestrode his great charger as the column started out of the village and down the trail into the south. Tarzan and the golden lion stood beside him. Blake reached down and extended his hand to the ape-man. "Goodbye, sir," he said. "Goodbye," demanded Tarzan. "Aren't you coming home with us?" Blake shook his head. "No," he said. "I'm going back into the Middle Ages with the woman I love." Tarzan and Jad-bal-ja stood in the trail, watching as Sir James rode out toward the city of Nimr, the blue and silver of his pennon fluttering bravely from the iron tip of his great lance. The end.